friends of the Testament. Come back to that page you read, page 301 in the Pew Bible, 1 Samuel chapter 29. Achish sends David back to Ziklag. Friends, Robert Robinson, in his hymn, Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing, penned these words in verse 3. Prone to wander, Lord, I feel it. Prone to leave the God I love. Have you ever wandered so far away from the Lord? Have you ever wandered so far away from His will that you found yourself siding with the enemy, so to speak? Has that at one time ever been your experience? Prone to wander, Lord, I feel it. Prone to leave the God I love. Because at this moment in time, that's where David is. That's where David is. This handsome, gifted, brave, anointed, chosen king who would one day succeed Saul upon the throne of Israel had sadly, friends, lapsed in his trust in the Lord and had now compromised himself by going over to Achish, the king of Gath. In chapter 28, while Saul was engaged in his desperate attempts to seek God for direction on how to deal with the Philistines, and when the Lord did not answer him, sought to consult the witch of Endor, David was marching along with the Philistines en route to Aphek, that place where they would prepare for war against the nation of Israel. The sight of this military strength as they prepared for battle is one of the most awesome and impressive in all of Israel's history. Verse 2, look, battalion after battalion of heavily armed Philistines would be marching in rank to this place of encampment. Units of hundreds and thousands, verse 2. But look who's seen marching at the rear with Achish. David and his men. Fancy that. Seeing David and his men marching with the Philistines to fight against his own people is a graphic illustration of just how far he had drifted. It's a graphic illustration of just how far he had wandered away from the divine purposes of God for his life. David here was on the verge of utter calamity, even to the point where he is about to betray his own kinsfolk and his God. Left to himself, that's what this chapter would be all about. But for the mercy of God toward the wanderer. David's deceptive activity among the Philistines created, you see, a dilemma when he was conscripted to join the army assembled against Israel. But God, in his mercy and grace, did not abandon him to his sin. For what we see in this short chapter is God's providential hand upon David and his men from having to participate against their own people, verse 3. For when the military commanders of the Philistines saw their king, King Achish, with David and his 600 men, they protested. What about these Hebrews? What about these Hebrews? The very war chiefs and commanders of the various battalions of the Philistines sense that there's something not quite right. And they ask this remarkable question: what are these Hebrews doing here? You see, there's something not quite right with David and his men being among their ranks. To a man, with the exception of King Achish, the military leaders of the Philistines believed that come the heat of battle, David would turn allegiance and end up fighting against them, as was their experience back in 1 Samuel chapter 14, verses 20 to 23. For there we read, friends, then Saul and all his men assembled and went to battle. They found the Philistines in total confusion, striking each other with their swords. Those Hebrews who had previously been with the Philistines and had gone up with them to their camp went over to the Israelites who were with Saul and Jonathan. So the Lord rescued Israel that day, and the battle moved beyond Bethaven. The word Hebrew literally means the other side. The other side. What is the other side doing here? If we turn to Genesis chapter 14 and the words of verse 13, you'll find the term Hebrew used for the first time. Verse 13, Genesis 14. And there came one that had escaped and told Abram the Hebrew. Friends, the one that had escaped told Abram about the war that had taken place, which had carried away Lot and his family. Verse 14, when Abram heard that his relative had been taken captive, he called out the 318 trained men born in his household and went in pursuit as far as Dan. Abram the Hebrew was one who came from the other side. He came from the other side of the river in Ur of the Chaldeans. He was a sojourner in the land of promise. Christian brother, Christian sister, our testimony is not to be on the same side as the devil. Our testimony is not to be on the same side as the world, but on the other side. On the other side. That was the testimony of Israel on the night of the Passover, that they crossed over onto the other side. They separated from Egypt through the blood of the Lamb. They crossed through that Red Sea and beyond to Sinai, and 40 years later, they crossed over from the east of the Jordan into the land of their inheritance that God gave unto them. Israel, as we know, were a separate people, a called out people, and were known as such. They were a people who had not the gods of wood and stone. Their trust was not in the gods and in the practices of the heathen, but rather instead in Jehovah, the unseen, the true, and the living God of Israel. That was the nation David came from. And thus the Philistine leaders asked this question, what about these Hebrews? What are they doing here? As these leaders saw David marching at the rear, they questioned why there was one from the other side, one who was separated, one who was a worshipper of God, that he should be found fighting, siding amongst them and doing the things that they were doing. Why was there Hebrews among the Philistines? I want to stop there, friends, because that question, dear believer, can be asked with regard to many of God's people and what they are engaged in today. What business, answered honestly, does the child of God have in being in the ungodly places of this world? Have you ever been asked by someone, what are you doing here? I thought you were a Christian. You'd be the last person I'd expect to see here. Have you ever been asked that question? Have you been put on the spot, so to speak? What business did the child of God have in being in the ungodly places of the world? What business did the child of God have in watching those ungodly films or reading those ungodly books? What business does the child of God have in accommodating the world? Don't we sing the hymn, "Here from the world we turn"? Please let us beware of compromising our Christian testimony by aligning ourselves with the ungodly and being led into situations which would cause us to deny the Lord. It matters how we live our lives, does it not? Achish replied to the concerns of his commanders, verse 3b. Is this not David, who was an officer of Saul, king of Israel? He has already been with me for over a year, and from the day he left Saul until now, I have found no fault in him. Why did King Achish of the Philistines like David so much? Why was he taken in by David? Well, the verses, friends, of 1 Samuel chapter 27, verse 8 to chapter 28, verse 2 reveal a case of grand deception. David, for 16 months, again and again, deceived King Achish, for he allowed the king to believe that he was killing the Israelites, his own people, when in fact he was destroying other enemies of Israel. 1 Samuel 27, verse 10, when Achish asked, where did you go raiding today? David would say, look, against the Negev of Judah, or against the Negev of Jerahmeel, or against the Negev of the Kenites. When in fact, verse 8 of 1 Samuel 27, David was raiding and fighting Israel's enemies, the Gerushites, the Girzites, and the Amalekites. David was also obliged to cover his deception by shedding much blood, not leaving a man or woman alive that they might inform on him. King Achish's trust in David was so strong that he said to himself, verse 12 of 1 Samuel 27, he, David, hath made his people Israel utterly to abhor him. Therefore he will be my servant forever. Achish was deceived, you see, friends. David had deceived him for 16 months. We may deceive others. We may deceive others and appear to be walking with the Lord, when in reality we're not. And God knows the heart, doesn't he? We cannot deceive him. I can deceive you, you can deceive me, but God's not sleeping. Back into 1 Samuel 29, verse 4. But the Philistine commanders were angry with him and said, send the man back, that he may return to the place you assigned him. He must not go into battle with us. Isn't this the David they sang about in their dances? Saul has slain his thousands and David his tens of thousands. How could the commanders of the Philistines ever forget that day when Goliath was felled to the ground by a single stone that was shot out of David's very sling? These men, if they didn't remember the actual details of that battle, certainly hadn't forgotten the song that the people of Israel sang when David came back from defeating their champion. Do you see it there? Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. And those tens of thousands the people sang about were tens of thousands of Philistines. Verse 6. So Achish called David and said to him, as surely as the Lord lives, you have been reliable, and I would be pleased to have you to serve with me in the army. From the day you came to me until now, I have found no fault in you. But the rulers, the Philistine commanders, don't approve of you. Turn back and go in peace. Do nothing to displease the rulers. Verse 8. But what have I done? Asked David. What have you found against your servant from the day I came to you until now? Why can't I go and fight against the enemies of the Lord my king? Now we do not know whether David here was sincere in expressing his willingness to fight against Israel, or he was faking disappointment. It's hardly conceivable, is it, that he really would fight against his own people and against his best friend Jonathan. But what David did not realize was that this rejection was the means of his deliverance. It was the hand of God in causing the Philistines to reject David and his men, which spared him from doing the unthinkable. The Lord, dear friends, was overruling his folly. And no doubt, and David no doubt, was glad to escape this moral dilemma. And his dismissal is now confirmed, verse 9. Achish answered, I know that you have been as pleasing in my eyes as an angel of God. Nevertheless, the Philistine commanders have said, he must not go up with us into battle. Now get up early, along with your master's servants who have come with you, and leave in the morning as soon as it is light. And if you're following, look, the chapter concludes by noting that the outcome of this remarkable verbal confrontation was that David headed south as the Philistines moved north to engage Saul for what would prove to be the last time. So David and his men got up early in the morning to go back to the land of the Philistines, and the Philistines went up to Jezreel. Proverbs chapter 21, verse 1. The king's heart is in the hand of the Lord. He directs it like a watercourse wherever he pleases. And those words are crystal clear in this chapter, though they are also hidden. The king's heart is in the hands of the Lord. He directs it like a watercourse wherever he pleases. The fact that God's involvement in these events is not explicitly mentioned in our passage reflects the nature of his providence. You see, often God's sovereign will and purposes are achieved in ways that are unseen. God moves in mysterious ways, his wonders to perform the hymnist writes. The same was true, friends, in the book of Esther. God's name is not mentioned throughout the whole book, but his hand can be seen on every page. Don't go into Esther now, but let me just give you a little background here. Notice how things happen, chapter 6 and chapter 7. Haman was going to come before the king Xerxes the next morning to ask for the death of all the Jews. He especially wanted to be rid of good old Mordecai. But that night, the king couldn't sleep. Why that particular night? After all, the king's bed would have been the best and also the most comfortable, surely. So the king sent for the book of the Chronicles of what had happened during his reign. Why choose to read a book? Why not something else? Why that special book? He then read how Mordecai had saved his life. Why did he turn to that page? Then he found that Mordecai had never been rewarded. Why was Mordecai never rewarded? And why did the king decide to do it now? The king's heart is in the Lord's hands as the rivers of water. He turneth it whithersoever he will. So when wicked Haman the next morning came seeking the lives of the Jews, he found such a different king from the one he had known the day before. What shall be done to the man the king delighteth to honour? Asked the king. If you get a chance, please read Esther. Chapter 6 and 7 is where I am here. For it was Mordecai, not Haman, whom the king honoured, and who rode through the cities on the king's horse and in the king's robes. God moves in mysterious ways, his wonders to perform. It was God's interception. It was the providence of God which enabled David and his men to exit a nightmare situation and who overruled his foolishness. There's a little chorus in Mission Praise. God will make a way where there seems to be no way. He works in ways we cannot see. He will make a way for me. Ever found yourself away from the Lord? Ever found yourself away in your walk with the Lord? Outside of his will and purpose? On the other side? Out there? You're from the world we turn. Christian brother, Christian sister, please, even if we, like David, lapse and are faithless and no trust in the Lord, prone to wander, even when we lose heart, compromise or backslide, God is gracious in his dealings with us. Thank God he doesn't cast off his people in their foolishness. God will make a way where there seems to be no way. He works in ways we cannot see. He will make a way for me. 2 Timothy 2:13. He remains faithful. He cannot deny himself. Has that been your experience? Friends, in closing, sadly many Christians have heaven on their tongues, but the world in their hearts. Let's beware, please, of compromising our testimony by aligning ourselves with the other side. May we learn from David's wandering and not put God to the test by getting into that place or that situation where the Lord has to rescue you from it. Or that God would be merciful to a wandering saint, even this afternoon possibly, for his name's sake. Amen.